honorable mention, Blade. Got to throw Blade in there. That
Yeah,
kind of kicked off
yeah,
the Marvel series. So we gotta give Blade their flowers as well.
yeah.
No doubt. Yeah. Gotta give Blade some love there because and you know who gives Blade a lot of love to is Marvel as a whole, because that was kind of the introduction on how to do these superhero style movies and really build on that story and make it into something. It gave the impression that Marvel could turn into something. So for sure we can give Blade some love. Uh Blade and Blade 2 for that matter. Hello, and welcome to the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Chasen, and like always, I'll be joined today by the great team that brings you cupofteacritiques.com. We are excited to get started on our podcast where we will share our unique perspectives on several areas in movies and television. At Cup of Tea Critiques, we review movie and television series and tag them with the tea brew that evokes a feel for the production. In this way, you can decide for yourself if they're your cup of tea. Here on the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast, we will dive even deeper into the productions and topics we broach on our website, engaging in conversation and sharing our unique perspectives. Ready for a deep look with a deep brew? This week's topic, Sinners and the Mystique of Vampirism. So let's get started. Cup of Tea Critiques is a family business, and I'm here with my brother Chris, my mother Reba, and my father Terry. And fam, we wanted to start off today talking about Sinners, which is the brand new vampire production that just came out in theaters. And Mom, Dad, you guys have both had the opportunity to check this one out. So let me go ahead and kick it to you guys. Tell us about that experience and what you felt about that movie.
I would call it an experience for sure. I am not, as you guys know, I am not a fan of scary movies, period. And I thought this was quite effective in being scary, but it was also very good though. I saw Ryan Coogler's interview with Jimmy Fallon earlier in the week, where he talked about what why he decided to do this film. He was on with Michael B. Jordan, and he talked about his uncle's love for blues music, and that he lost his uncle. And he decided to do this film as kind of a tribute to him. And so blues music was a huge element of this film. And it was done in the Delta, and I don't want to give away too much, but I thought it was a very, very well done film. I thought Michael B. Jordan was just excellent as a set of twins in this film.
Yeah. I enjoyed it for pretty much the same reasons. The music really was an integral part of the movie. It flowed really well from beginning to end. And they mixed in the music and the occult, which is interesting. It's kind of reminded me of the whole notion of the devil goes down to Georgia, and that kind of thing. Um, I wouldn't say that I was scared so much by the movie. I found how they brought vampirism into the movie quite late into it. I say maybe about a third or more of the way into it before they actually got into that. So it didn't present itself as a scary movie. It evolved into that. So I thought that was pretty cool. That was a nice way of bringing around that and pulling in all of those different elements, the music, the occult, and vampirism.
I thought it really showed how creative you can be with anything that's been done before, any genre that we've seen before, or any subgenre that we've seen before, because it just took vampire movies, but it also included, like you said, blues, elements of cultural appropriation, and it put it in a new set, in a slightly different setting. Whereas, when I hear vampire movie, I think of like Victorian era, or I think, there's a certain aesthetic that comes to mind in terms of where it's taking place, the characters involved, the attire, so on and so forth. And they removed that and kind of put the backdrop as just 1930s Mississippi. It just showed how much you can change about a genre and create something that we haven't really seen before. And so yeah, I loved it for all those reasons too.
Chris, you mentioned the Victorian era and how vampire movies typically, shoot back to the past. So with that, I'm going to politely try and kick it over to our father here because, Dad, you have the most history with vampire movies out of all of us, or vampire productions. So can you give our audience an insight as to like what really drew you into this subgenre as a whole?
Sure, I'll go past the part where you just called me old, but vampire movies in particular have kind of piqued my interest for a long time. Ever since I was a kid, I really did enjoy them. And a lot of it was because of the mystery of those stories. I know there's the mystery, and then there's the thought of the imagination part of it. Here's a being that literally could live for hundreds of years, but not really living. It was that weird thing of the Walking Dead. They were dead, but yet still alive. They saw the people in their lives come and go, and that supposedly was part of the curse of it, because vampirism was supposed to be a curse. This person was cursed to live but not live. And those to me were kind of like interesting dichotomies, so to speak. So that's kind of what sort of drew me into it. It's the whole mystery of it, and we'll get into some more detail about what those elements are.
Chris, you and Dad got together and saw Nosferatu when you were in town for Christmas break. And so I'm just curious for yourself, is there something within this subgenre that really appeals to you as well?
It's the intimate nature of it, the seduction of it all. I mean, I think it's interesting that like vampires are generally they're very sophisticated, like they're dressed kind of to the nines a little bit, and they speak very regally, and it's all part of this seducing people. It's all part of luring people in, and I also love that vampires can have they can be three-dimensional in a sense. They could sometimes question themselves or question their nature or fall in love with the people that they're supposed to be preying on. And so the way even though vampires have this mission or this stated drive, essentially they can be complex enough to question it or to have regrets.
And then just speaking for myself, I know I was late getting into the subgenre of vampires, but for me, what's always appealing to me, anyways, is that I've noticed over the last 20-ish years that there have been different variations of how they want to cover vampirism. You can deal with it from like the action movie perspective, like we saw with Underworld. You can see it from a comedic perspective a little bit from Dark Shadows. And so just my point is that I've kind of enjoyed that people have tried to dabble a little bit here and there on how they want to actually present this. But Dan, I'm going to go back to you here. You, like I said, you've got the history with vampire productions. Can you take us a little bit through like the history of vampirism in cinema?
Well, the first movie that is given credit for being a first vampire movie is Nosferatu in 1922. And as you can imagine, back then, the cinematography and everything was not that great. A lot of the portrayal of the character was sort of rough. And over the years, obviously, as cinematography got better and better, some of that stuff, and even in terms of portraying some of the characteristics of vampires, got better and better. Dracula is probably the most famous name surrounding vampirism and vampire stories. And in 1931, Bela Lugosi played Dracula, and that was kind of the iconic movie of Dracula.
It's delicious. And now I'll leave you. Well, good night. Good night, Mr. Renfield.
Then, you kind of move forward into like 1979. There was another portrayal of Dracula by Frank Langella. And that, to Chris's point, was he was specifically picked to portray that because of his stature, his being such a handsome character. So he played right into that hypnotic mystery and seduction.
Good evening. Miss Seward.
Good evening, Count.
Dr. Seward. Miss Van Helsing. My savior. I trust you're feeling improved.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I don't think she looks well at all.
In most of those classic stories, there was a single vampire. And so that was the one central character throughout the movie that was preying on people and turning others into vampires. But as you move through the genre, it started moving towards covens and groups of vampires and even bringing in werewolves. So the stories evolved to portraying a single character as a vampire into multiple characters as vampires to, the modern day underworld.
So, Mom, given some of those things that Dad mentioned there, you've also talked about how, in general, scary movies just aren't your type of deal. But Dad also mentioned that when it comes to the history of vampirism in productions, it always had something to do with a bit of a sex appeal, or they always tried to make sure that vampires look good, all that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering why didn't that work for you in terms of drawing you into this genre?
Because he bit blood. So that was it for me. The cinematography was always very dark in those presentations. And so, for example, when I was a kid, there was a show that came on called Dark Shadows. And I would get out of school at 3:15. I think that show went off at about 3:30 or it came on at 3:30. I can't remember what. My mom loved that show. The main character in Dark Shadows was a vampire named Barnabas Collins. My mom loved Barnabas Collins. I never understood how she could like a vampire. I never understood it. That show ran for about 5 years.
I didn't know what your plans were. I never would have helped you.
That's why I waited until now to tell you.
You promised you wouldn't go near her.
I tried not to, but it was no use. I couldn't resist.
You can't go through with it, Mr. Barnabas. It's wrong.
Don't tell me what I can't or can do.
I thought you loved Miss Josette.
I do.
And how can you do such a cruel thing to her?
And school was just a few minutes away, and so it would be on when I would get home from school. And I remember the scary music that came along with it when it would go off. I remember how dark the lighting was for the show. I remember it just always seemed so scary to me. And in terms of good, you're talking about, 7, 8, 9 years old, and you're talking, I didn't care about that stuff then. So I just wasn't feeling that. It was dark and he bit. That was enough for me.
Yeah, the underlying theme in almost all vampire movies has always been the notion of sex, romance, and mystery, and the power of the vampire to seduce people who may at first be wary or not wanting to be involved or anything like that. The power of hypnosis. They could control people that were potential victims, or even people that, they just wanted to get rid of, so to speak, so that they can concentrate on the object of their desire. And there was always this notion of this desire from the vampire.
Both of you make up some good points. And Mom, I think I want to go back to your underlying point was that you were much younger when you were introduced to vampires. So that's why the physical appeal didn't work for you. You weren't developed in that mindset at that time. You were under 10 years old. And to that point, my introduction to vampires was the Count in Sesame Street and Count Chocula, neither of which had anything to do with looks, except for that, the cereal for Count Chocula looked great, but that's about it. So I didn't get introduced to a lot more of those kinds of deals until I was more like into my 20s, which is why I think for me, I can understand the physical allure of the characters and everything like that. Chris, when we were doing pre-production, you actually pointed that out in particular about, the sex appeal of the actors and such. Is that what kind of, did that play a role for you as well? And kind of expound on like your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who likes horror and I enjoy a good monster movie. Generally the monsters are, hideous and without thought and something that you would very obviously run away from. And they're ravenous without any refinement almost. And so I think that's the usually we have very good looking actors playing the vampires or even playing the people trying to catch vampires. And so I think just in the sense of vanity, yeah, I think that's what drew me to a lot of drew me to some of the vampire shows and movies that I consumed.
To your point in that sense with the good looking actors and such, I personally feel like a lot of the careers were launched out of this type of subgenre for some of these people, but I don't feel like, obviously we can't ignore the fact that they were good looking people and had opportunities as it is. But I think back to like the Vampire Diaries, and I didn't know any of those actors really like much. I was familiar with the two main male leads there, Paul Wesley and Ian Somerhalder. I had seen them both in previous shows, but they weren't main characters. But I absolutely believe that the combination of the two of them, with Nina Dobrev being good looking, not to mention some of the other, at the time, at least when it first came out, the minor characters with Candace King and Cat Graham playing those, like the attractiveness of these actors is what drew a lot of people into watching these shows as it is. And then their careers seem to just take off as a result. And I admit I was a big fan of that and the spinoff shows, but it was, to your point, like there's some sex appeal to definitely hold your attention. And then thankfully the shows actually had some pretty good writing to last at least a little while.
Hi.
Hi. What happened? Why am I here right now?
I don't know about Bonnie, but Damon wanted to sacrifice everything to save you.
Yeah, a lot of those are, interestingly enough, predicated on the kind of star-crossed lovers theme. And it's interesting that they use the this underlying theme for the vampire movies. I think about, to your point, the Vampire Diaries and then Underworld, as a movie. The notion was that you had, the vampire, the female lead was a vampire, the male lead was a werewolf, and, they were from separate houses, but they fell in love and, on and on and on. So a lot of more modern day vampire stories are built on that star-crossed lovers idea.
So I used to have a job where I had to kind of search for certain songs from different big record labels on YouTube when YouTube was kind of first becoming popular, and a lot of the videos I would find that had songs in them were just fan made videos, edited clips of WB shows, and the most popular one, I would say by a good margin, was the Vampire Diaries. It would be people cutting up clips of Damon, of Stefan, Elena, sometimes just the actors at conventions talking to people like they were just these super fans that would make these tribute videos. And so I think that kind of illustrated to me the kind of star appeal behind the main characters. And you think Underworld, if someone's a casual fan, I'm sure the first thing they'll tell you is the movie with where Kate Beckinsale is wearing a leather suit the whole time. So, in this movie, in Sinners, Michael B. Jordan, Haley Steinfeld. So there's been a lot of actors with sex appeal, in these roles in these TV shows. I mean, True Blood, same thing. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, same thing. And they even managed to create different spinoffs. So, so they capitalized off the sex appeal to the fullest.
Absolutely. And the sex appeal definitely, I believe, plays a role in people going to check out Sinners, because as much as I'm not happy to say it out loud, Michael B. Jordan is not exactly an ugly dude. Just saying, quit taking the attention of all the women that I want to talk to, dude. But Haley Steinfeld, for that matter, too, is definitely drawing in the male contention on that side, too. Like, what's up, Haley? But spinning off of that, though, like one thing with these movies and productions we're talking about is they're all under the idea of like monster stories. So what separates vampire stories from the other monster stories?
Sure, I'll take that one. Most monster stories, as Chris said, they're the monsters, whatever monster is hideous. Something that you don't want to be. Everybody's running away from. And if you start zoning in on some of those zombies they're mindless. They walk around, biting people and turning them into zombies. There's not much to the character of a zombie. Mummies, similar types of things. Vampires and werewolves are creatures that are, well, at least they're portrayed as almost normal human beings. In many of those movies, you don't even know that they are what they are until it gets revealed in some way. Some attack happens or whatever. So that's a huge difference between those two or several types of movies and TV shows.
I would I would say the same thing. The vampires are the most kind of relatable to an audience to look at and empathize with on some level. Unless dating gets really hard, I don't think we're going to see anybody across from a zombie at Fogo de Chao on a Thursday. I don't think anybody's gonna invite one of the creatures from Last of Us into their house for a glass of wine or something. And I just think vampires they're the most humanoid of these monsters. And also, I mean, they can live forever. They probably have some traits that we wish we had. We wish we could seduce people, or I mean, we wish we could have super strength and live forever. And they have some traits that people would probably want. So I think they're relatable and both admirable, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah, for me, in terms of the MonsterVerse stuff, I got into vampires because of actually the at the time it was like a 2-day mini movie for House of Frankenstein. It was made in the late 90s. It was a remake of a previous production. I forgot when the original came out and everything, but that is actually what drew me into vampires and werewolves, because that production actually covered all of the MonsterVerse. You had Frankenstein, you had the Mummy, you had Dracula, so you got exposure to each one, and they did a good job of trying to portray each character as unique within their own, style. And I still felt drawn into vampires and werewolves. Mom, do you feel like, in terms of the MonsterVerse anyways, just to take a quick tangent here, like, is there a difference in your appeal to this genre as a whole, and it's more specific to vampires that you kind of shy away from, or do you kind of just say all of them are scary and I'm good?
I think you guys made very, very good points about the link between sex appeal and vampires, and the point about vampires being the most relatable because they are, more in human form than any of the other monsters. And I don't think I'm giving anything away when I say that Michael B. Jordan becomes a vampire in Sinners. And I'm sorry, he's good looking, whether he's a vampire or not. So I had absolutely no problem with him either way. So yeah, I suppose there's a separation, but I still find, to be honest, the idea of, being bitten and blood being drawn out of me, or whatever the heck it is that werewolves do, and don't want to be in the presence of mummies and, no World War Z zombies.
It's too loud. It's too loud. Coming over the top!
I'd rather just avoid that altogether.
So y'all, she does not like things that bite. So that we already understand why you didn't
Common
enjoy
theme
Jaws
there, huh?
like that, Mom. I get you. And by the way, just a reminder, Mom, you are happily married for a long time now, so Michael B is not an option. Just so you know.
Well, your dad looks, and so do I.
I'm gonna stay far away.
We're
from
not
that
dead,
your
as your
son.
dad always says. We're not dead.
Okay, transitioning. So I ran right into that one, didn't I?
Yeah.
I
yep.
do. I do want to say that we've brought up the other monster, the other monsters within the genre and everything. But Dad, help us out here. What are some of the rules and like the conventions of vampirism? Help our audience understand these.
Okay, deep breath, because there's a long list of stuff associated with vampirism, or so to speak. The rules are things that you pretty much expect in some sort of vampire production. There's the notion that garlic somehow burns them, or they're repelled by it. So people wear clothes of garlic to ward off those vampires and essentially even other evil spirits, so to speak. But it's particularly prominent in vampire stories. The notion also that a crucifix repels them. They're repelled by daylight. Daylight stakes through the heart will kill a vampire. The fact that, and this is probably the spookiest part of it, is not being able to see them in mirrors. And because although they are walking, you can see them, they are dead, so they really don't exist. So that's another one of those things. The fact that the sight of blood excites them, that they kind of lose control. That's typically vampires in most productions are well controlled until maybe you anger them or something like that. But they kind of lose it when they see the sight of blood. They're attracted to that. They have a power of hypnosis. They can hypnotize people to get them to do things that's being victims or others that they're manipulating. So they have that power of manipulation. And some of the funnier ones are the fact that they can turn into a bat and fly away. And I've mentioned the curse of the walking dead. They're destined to walk among the living, but not be a part of them. That they retreat to coffins at night so that they're not exposed to the daylight. And silver bullets can kill them. And then the one that we were all most intrigued by is the need to be invited in. And they did that in Sinners, and they do it in many, many vampire productions. This notion that a vampire can't enter the place where people are unless they're invited in. And that kind of goes back to the notion of the house being a sacred place. And therefore, the invitation is necessary for them to break that boundary.
Yeah, that, like you said, that was one that really intrigued us when we were talking about this in pre-production. And just to give our audience a bit, like, we were really trying to figure out how to define this for you guys. And essentially, like you were alluding to, Dad, it's, the house is sacred. The idea of inviting the vampire in is akin to inviting evil into the home. So it's the idea that, the home is a sacred, safe space, and it's a choice of the living to invite evil or darkness into their house. And that's the reason for that part of the vampire lore. With that in mind, Dad, you listed a lot of different things in there, but not every production on vampirism has had all of those rules in place. Do you find yourself more intrigued with the more things they include, or do you feel some of those to not necessarily need to be in place for a production to necessarily to be appealing.
No, I don't think all of those elements necessarily have to be in there. And quite frankly, I don't think this is giving any huge part away from the movie. The viewing of A Vampire in Mirrors was completely eliminated from Sinners. No where, shape, form, or fashion was that introduced in the movie whatsoever.
That's interesting though, because that leads me to the next question for me. So as you can see, one of the things in vampire lore was removed or changed in this case, but it didn't keep you from enjoying Sinners. The idea that you can see the vampire in the mirror. However, if some of those things in that lore that you refer to are changed, I know my answer to this question, but do you feel, Chris, I'm gonna kick it to you first. Do you feel if any of those things are manipulated in any way that it actually can detract from the enjoyment of a production on vampirism?
Only if they're inconsistent. Some movies, and this is a problem in horror maybe more than anything, is that they'll I think a lot of horror movies suffer from this, where they when it's a monster or a group of monsters, they're inconsistent about their limitations or their abilities or the effect of them. And I think it kind of hurts the overall logic of the script. I think if you make a choice and stick with it throughout the runtime, it's most likely going to work out unless it's clumsily executed. So I think it's just about consistency.
So in other words, the consistency, you mentioned monsters, and I think this is part of the reason why I go crazy about this, but if you change something such as, you put a vampire in the sun and instead of burning, they turn into diamonds, they're no longer a monster. And if we're talking about this landing under a MonsterVerse umbrella,
is there
or whatever,
some
like that genre
movie you're referring to?
I'm pretty certain that the person that made this is very well aware of my feelings on this. And I'm just going to reiterate it for our new audience members that are maybe checking us out for the first time of several episodes. But the bottom line is, vampires do not glitter diamond-like. Their skin doesn't turn to diamonds. The sunshine kills them, and don't manipulate that and turn it into something crappy.
No bed?
No, I don't sleep.
Ever?
No, not at all.
Had to get on my soapbox for that. Go ahead, you all run with it.
No, that was pretty weak. I'm with you on that. That's, yeah.
This has been stuck in Brandon's craw for a while, so I'm glad he got it out. You feel better, Brandon?
No, because I need that person to apologize. The creator of that nonsense needs to apologize for I have to choose my words carefully here, for messing with vampire lore. That's what I'll say. They need to apologize for messing with that piece of vampire lore.
I agree with you that you have to be true to, there's some main elements you have to be true to you guys' point. If they didn't respond to the sight of blood and they're supposed to be a vampire, I think that would just, I think that story would just lose all credibility. And I'm not a fan of these stories, but that would be problematic for me. I mean, Terry talks enough about vampires around me. She just loves this stuff. And so I know what to watch for. I know what's true and what's not. So that would be real problematic if something like that was left out.
You bring them up in context, right, Dad? You bring them up in context.
Yeah.
And another thing about vampires in the middle of the Bulls game or something.
Sometimes your dad is giving a lecture on this stuff, and we have not watched anything that has anything to do with vampires. I don't know where they come from.
Yeah, to your point about being true to certain things, I don't have a problem with them taking license with things if they're being clever. But to your point, Brandon, that was going a little bit too far.
I mean, I feel like there's, no matter what style of production we're talking about, there is always a romantic element to anything that deals with vampires. Or I should say a love element. I shouldn't say romantic element, because, Vampire Diaries, we obviously saw, Elena and Stefan, Elena and Damon, blah, 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 with that situation. When you say Underworld, there was obviously the appeal between the vampire and the eventual hybrid. Like there's always it's some sort of love element. And the reason why I say love element is there was also the TV show The Passage that was out. It came out in 2019. And there was a love between the little girl in the production and her protector and everything. It wasn't a romantic love, but he did obviously care for her and want to take care of her in that sense. And
Fanning was dying, and I saved him. And I don't know why. I think that's why he didn't kill me.
Are you worried that you'll become like him?
Maybe. I'm scared, Agent.
She had a special story behind her. I don't want to ruin it for anybody that's going to check out the one season of the show. It was fun, but I get why it didn't last. But anyways, the point being is that there was an element to this girl's existence that was hidden from the audience, and only this guy understood it, and he wanted to protect her because of that. And so vampire productions as a whole have a love element, which is why to me it feels unnecessary to go over the top and introduce something like changing a vampire's skin, which I'm not trying to harp on that. I'm just saying that in general, we don't have to change much of vampire lore, because the centralized pieces to stories, in my opinion, is that they are somebody to be feared or something to be feared, and that there is some sort of love element. Those, I think, are like the two central factors in this. As long as there's something to be feared and that there's some sort of love element, then anything else can be done to make the production something good.
Yeah. And that fear generally is out of the fact that the vampire is portrayed as this very powerful person. And so hence part of the fear is that, wow, there are lots of things that this person can do. They're a very powerful person. One thing I wanted to hit on was some of the differences among vampire stories, things that were a bit atypical. The Interview with a Vampire wasn't your typical vampire story. It basically revolved around interviewing a vampire, not your typical vampire stalking someone. As we mentioned when we were talking in pre-production, Daybreakers, which was about vampirism as a disease. And one of my all-time favorites in terms of, it was a comedy. It was a vampire story, but it was a comedy, was The Fearless Vampire Killers, 1967 movie that was directed by Roman Polanski. But there's a scene in here, and I went through this in pre-production, and I laugh every time I remember or think about this. This is like the one thing that stood out in that entire movie that I'll always remember is this the notion of repellents. We talked about garlic and crosses being repellents to vampires, but they took a little bit of poetic license in this movie, and one of the characters tried to fiend off a Jewish vampire with a cross. And the vampire just dies laughing at him and goes, "Have you got the wrong vampire?" And he proceeds to attack them.
You got the wrong vampire.
So that's kind of a license that I would see as, something that's acceptable as opposed to what you were talking about. They just totally went against this notion of, what's been typical is cross being a repellent.
See, I love that. And that's that's something you can change and still, and you talked about it being a comedy as well. Like we talked in our pre-production meeting about the question on, can vampire productions fall under multiple, genres, other umbrellas, and not just have to be under like a monster scary type of deal. You just mentioned comedy. There's a bit of the romance. We've had action. So that feels like the answer to the question. I'm going to spin this though. The reason why I go to that is I want to know for the panel if there is a favorite of these, a favorite type of vampire production for you. Chris, why don't you go ahead and start for us?
Definitely Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the show. I thought it was a good intersection of a lot of different popular genres. I mean, it had a lot of humor in it. Um, it had burgeoning stars, right? Sarah Michelle Gellar, um, David Boreanaz, James Marsters.
You hurt? You're not moving so well.
Get out.
We have to talk.
I really don't.
Well, this isn't just about you, as much as you'd like it to be.
You spoke, I listened. Now leave.
I'm sorry.
And it stayed true to a lot of material. They traditional vampire material, and it had teen dramatic elements, which was a lot of the popular shows at that time were teen dramas, and it had action in it, and they managed to kind of shuffle in and out a lot of different characters, and even other types of monsters that she had to deal with, and even other types of slayers that she had to deal with. So I just thought that was a very entertaining show, and I mentioned earlier how popular the Vampire Diaries became. Another other big category of tribute videos was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So yeah, that's definitely my favorite one out of all of them.
So for myself, I would have to say that Underworld was my favorite of those types of productions, or is my favorite, particularly the first one. For me, it is a matter of, I like this genre to be dark. I like there to be a little bit of an edge to it a bit. And I felt like that was what pulled me into this. Plus the fact that there's a fight and these werewolves, it's a battle between werewolves and vampires. And I felt like both entities were extremely dangerous.
I loved my daughter. But the abomination growing in her womb was a betrayal of me and of the Coven. I did what was necessary to protect the species, as I am forced to do yet again.
And that's what made me enjoy this, is that there's a fear factor that no matter who wins this war, we as humans have to contend with the winner of that, the victor of that battle. And that's kind of in the back. They don't really go towards that, but that's in the back of my mind, is that shoots, humans have to deal with the victor of this battle between this group, the vampires that are, they're elegant, they are organized, they're highly intelligent, and they seem really prepared. And then, their counterparts with the werewolves. So that's why Underworld was my winner in this style. But I do also want to do a nod to the show, The Originals, because it was a spinoff of Vampire Diaries, but it had my favorite vampire of all time, which was Klaus Michelson, played by Joseph Morgan. And he's my favorite because he was a very complex individual. He's very smart. He obviously had a few characters that he fell in love with over time. He was very protective of his family, and he was absolutely ruthless.
Strange. House is conspicuously absent of our lupine guests. I do hope it wasn't on my account.
I sent Haley and her poorly groomed husband off to spend the day with their werewolf brethren to test the limits of their new abilities, leaving me to deal with family business as I see fit.
Niklaus, Rebecca's situation has taken a turn. We may need Freya's assistance, so whatever you are planning here, don't.
If you get on his bad side, don't expect to live for very long. And the way they portrayed the vampires there, how quickly they could attack, with their ridiculous speed, you knew that you crossed them, you were probably gone. So that is one thing I do want to nod out, is that, like, out of all of these productions, that's probably my favorite vampire out of everything I've seen so far. Mom, you look like you were about to say something as well.
I would have to say it's Sinners. And the reason for that, I know this sounds cheesy, but the reason for that is I really liked the fusion of elements in that movie. This movie had a really strong storyline. I thought the acting was really strong. I love that it had such a diversity of characters. I like the costumes, how colorful the costumes were. I like the infusion of the blues with the storyline. I thought they had some of everything. in this show that made it just work so very well. I mean, really, Ryan Coogler just did such an incredible job with this film. It is really a very, very, very well put together film. I don't know how you can go and not enjoy it, even if you're not a fan of vampires.
Yeah, okay. For me, I could say there are a lot of stories that I like for various reasons, but if I had to land on one, it would be Underworld, the first movie, because it brought this notion of vampires as a community, werewolves as a community, the covens, and the notion of a hybrid, which had, to my knowledge, had never been done in any vampire story.
Michael, you're unique. There's never been a hybrid before. Your powers could be limitless.
There were always separate characters, and sometimes they were pitted against each other in, some particular movie or another. But this one really did it for me. I like the fact that Selene was a warrior. So there are just a bunch of elements to that story, and including the star-crossed lovers part of it. I thought there was a good fusion of a lot of different things in that one that made it probably my favorite of all.
Honorable mention, Blade. Got to throw Blade in there. That kind of kicked off the Marvel series. So we gotta give Blade their flowers as well.
Yeah,
no doubt. Yeah, gotta give Blade some love there.
I think I was a teenager the last time. I don't remember the last time I saw it. It was
Well, you all bringing it up makes me think I gotta go see it again.
Yeah,
I'll say this about Blade. What was really cool about Blade is it was, for me, like one of the biggest and first like action flicks with a black lead.
Mm-hmm.
That was one thing. The idea of a vampire being black is another thing. Like every other vampire production to date always was with white people, and there's obviously nothing wrong with that. It's just that it was one of those things that having Blade be a black, almost like superhero / anti-hero, being a vampire, got to watch him be compassionate and ruthless and just straight like a badass as a fighter in there. Like all of those things were really appealing about it. They did a good job of having their theme, sticking with it, and it didn't feel rushed. And it made me curious when they started having more vampire productions later on. Can they live up to this?
Quit. I'm getting a little tired of chopping you up. Thought I might try fire for a change. Give my regards to Frost.
Another dark one, big action flick. There was some love in the first and second, so it keeps that theme of what makes a good vampire movie something to fear and there to be some sort of love involved. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this edition of the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. Thank you so much for listening and figuring out your cup of tea along with us. Honestly, we could go on and on like we do at our dinner table, but we look forward to you joining us again next week for another great discussion. Make sure you rate and follow the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Make sure to leave a comment and share your favorite vampire production with us. You can stay in the loop on all things COTC by subscribing on our website at cupofteacritiques.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Check out our Instagram at Cup of Tea Critiques and on Letterboxd at COT Critiques. For Reba, Terry, and Chris, I'm Brandon. We'll see you next week for another deep look with a deep brew.